The glass facade of Lancaster Holdings towered over the Chicago skyline, like a silent judge, its steel edges slicing through the early morning mist. Inside, on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere felt colder than the October wind howling outside. Damian Lancaster liked it that way. The employees who dared walk these hallways understood one thing clearly: fear kept mistakes away. Or at least it should have. Sophie Grant, the long-serving HR manager, stood in her tidy office holding yet another resignation letter between manicured fingers. She read it once more, as if the words might magically rearrange themselves into something less humiliating for the company's spotless image. Ethan Cole, her junior assistant, hovered behind her shoulder, pretending to check his phone, but clearly waiting for her to speak. Sophie inhaled, exhaled, then placed the envelope gently on her glass desk. 12th this year, she said without looking at him. Ethan raised his eyebrows, not daring to make a joke. Sophie almost admired that. Last week, he would have tried to lighten the mood with a half-witted remark about Lancaster's revolving door of executive assistants. Not today. Not when the air seemed so tight with tension that even jokes would suffocate in it. Who was it this time? Ethan asked carefully. Margaret Lane. Sophie replied, brushing invisible lint off her navy blazer. She lasted 2 weeks and 5 days. She cited impossible expectations, psychological stress, and physical exhaustion. Ethan's lips twitched. She should have known. They all should have known. Everybody knew what working directly under Damian Lancaster meant. He didn't fire people. He bled them dry of confidence and sleep until they fled on their own. Sophie pinched the bridge of her nose, willing away the headache pounding at her temples. Across the hall, behind a pair of thick oak doors, Damian was probably already reviewing reports with that laser focus of his eyes, sharp enough to cut through exes. Sophie wondered if he even cared that no one lasted more than a month in that office. Probably not. He only cared about results. Damian was 34, with a reputation carved out of steel and ice. He had expanded Lancaster Holdings from an old family trust fund into $1 billion spanning 5 countries. He was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely indifferent of mistakes. Some whispered that he was worse than his late father ever was, and that was saying something. The Lancaster legacy had always demanded blood and sacrifice. Damian simply demanded bold on schedule. Sophie flipped through the folder of candidate profiles on her desk. They were running out of options. The agency had stopped sending new people months ago. Word got around fast in corporate circles. No sane executive assistant wanted to be next in line for the guillotine on the 42nd floor. Ethan cleared his throat. Maybe we should try promoting from within again. Sophie shot him a dry look. And lose another promising junior to a nervous breakdown? I don't think so. He shrugged and looked down at his phone again. The hallway outside Sophie's office remained eerily quiet. Phones rang and hushed voices fuzz. Nobody dared to speak too loud. Everyone knew Lancaster had a sharp sense of hearing and an even sharper sense of disappointment. Just then, the door to Sophie's office cracked open, and a young woman peeked her head inside. She looked like she had run here straight from a college library, oversized coat hair in a messy bun. A tablet clutched tightly to her chest. Sophie blinked. "Can I help you?" The woman stepped inside and straightened her posture, her eyes wide, but determined. "Hi, my name is Clara Bennett. I'm here to submit an application for the executive assistant position." Ethan coughed out a laugh he quickly tried to hide. Sophie stared at Clara as if she were a ghost offering her a second chance at salvation. Clara shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her knuckles white around the tablet. "I know there's no official posting anymore, but I heard through a friend that you might still be looking. I'd really like to be considered." For a moment, the silence was so heavy that the hum of the city far below seemed deafening. Sophie studied the young woman carefully. Her coat was clearly second-hand, her shoes scuffed from too many bus rides. But her eyes had something that all the others had lost before they even walked through the door. Hunger. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was exactly what they needed. Sophie gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Sit down, Miss Bennet. Let's see if you have idea what you're about to walk into." Clara nodded once and dropped into the seat, her spine stiff, her tablet still pressed tight to her chest like a shield. Outside, the Chicago wind rattled the windows, but inside that office, the storm was only just beginning. Clara Bennet sat as still as she could manage in the rigid chair across from Sophie Grant, doing her best to keep her knees from bouncing under the desk. She could feel the weight of the HR manager's eyes scanning every inch of her thrift store coat, the faint coffee stain on her sleeve, the way her hands gripped her old tablet like a lifeline. Sophie leaned back, tapping a pen against the edge of the desk, studying Clara like an Anshi artifact that had been dropped into her orderly world. "Why this position?" Sophie asked finally. "There are safer ways to pay rent." Clara swallowed. She had rehearsed this answer in her head a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, every word felt too small. "I need the job," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "Or him." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Him, Damien Lancaster." Clara forced herself not to look away. "I know his reputation. I know no one lasts long. But I learn fast. I can handle myself. I don't scare easily." Ethan, standing off to the side pretending not to listen, let out a tiny snort. Clara's eyes flicked toward him, her stare sharp enough to make him look away. Sophie almost smiled. The girl had spine, at least. "What's your background?" Clara straightened her shoulders. "I have a degree in English literature. I used to freelance for magazines, and I teach writing workshops at the community center in my neighborhood. But writing doesn't pay the bills. Not enough to cover my mother's medical care. So here I am." Sophie's eyes softened for a fraction of a second at the mention of Clara's mother, but hardened again just as quickly. "And you think that qualifies you to manage Damien Lancaster's life, his travel, his clients, his entire empire?" Clara didn't flinch. "I know how to juggle chaos. I know how to pay attention to what people really mean when they talk. And I know how to stay calm when everything goes wrong." Sophie turned to Ethan. "Get Mr. Lancaster on the line." Ethan hesitated. Now Sophie snapped. Ethan jumped and practically fled the office to make the call. Clara exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Sophie leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Listen to me, Clara. This is not a normal job. It's not even a sane job. He will push you until you break. He will expect perfection, and then blame you when it doesn't exist. He does not care about your dreams or your reasons." Clara's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Then I guess I'm exactly what he needs." Sophie barked a short laugh. Despite herself, "You're stubborn. You'll need that." Just then, Ethan reappeared at the door, his face pale. "He'll see her." Sophie blinked. Now Ethan nodded. "He wants her in his office immediately." Sophie rose, smoothing the front of her blazer, and fixed Clara with a look halfway between pity and respect. "If you're smart, you'll walk away right now. No shame in it." Clara stood, hugging her tablet closer. "I appreciate the warning, Miss Grant, but I'm not here to run." Sophie watched her for a moment, then nodded once and gestured toward the hallway. "Good luck, Clara. You'll need every ounce of it." The corridor leading to Damien Lancaster's office felt longer than any street Clara had ever walked. The polished marble floors reflected her uncertain steps back at her. The hushed conversations behind closed doors fell silent as she passed, the quiet, like an invisible wave of curiosity and dread. She paused outside a pair of imposing dark wood doors. There was no nameplate. No need. Everyone knew who ruled the empire behind them. She knocked once, her knuckles sounding too soft against the heavy wood. "Come in." The voice was muffled, but unmistakable. Calm, cold, absolute. Clara opened the door and stepped into a room that looked more like the lair of a king than an office. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in crisp winter light. A massive glass desk dominated the space, neat stacks of files, arranged like obedient soldiers. And behind it, Damien Lancaster. He didn't look up right away. He finished typing something, hit enter, then folded his hands and fixed his steely gray eyes on her. For a moment, Clara felt like a moth pinned under glass. She forced herself to stand taller. "Clara Bennett," he said flatly. "You spilled coffee on my suit," Clara blurted before she could stop herself. She immediately regretted it, but to her surprise, Damien's eyebrow twitched in what might have been amusement. "Sit." Clara sat. The chair felt too big, too soft, like it might swallow her whole if she didn't hold herself together. "Sophie Grant thinks you are either foolish or fearless." "Which is it?" Clara took a breath. "Both, I suppose." Damien's eyes narrowed, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve or discard. "You know my record with assistants." "I do." "You know you're unqualified by every traditional metric." "I do." "Then why should I hire you?" Clara met his eyes, and for a heartbeat, her fear evaporated. "Because I won't try to be perfect. I'll just get the work done. And when I make mistakes, I'll fix them myself instead of quitting." Damien's mouth curved almost a smile, but not quite. "Bold, dangerous. We'll see if that boldness survives reality." He turned, pulled a thick folder from a drawer, and pushed it across the desk. He said, "Sort this. Identify the errors. Redraft the timeline. You have until 6 tonight." Clara felt her throat tighten, but she didn't let it show. "Consider it done." Damien leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "If you last the day, we'll talk about the week. And if you last the week—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara could almost hear the unspoken words echoing between them. "If you last the week, you might be the first to do so." Clara rose, took the folder, and forced herself not to run as she backed out of the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the challenge pressing into her chest. She drew in a steady breath. One day, one problem at a time. She could do this. She had to. Clara didn't waste a second. She found an empty corner office 3 doors down from Damien Lancaster's domain, pushed the heavy glass door open, and dropped the thick folder onto the pristine conference table. For a moment, she just stared at it, the way one might stare at a sealed box that could contain either a fortune or a bomb. The morning sun glinted off the polished surface, mocking her with how clean and untouched it was, so unlike the chaos she was about to unleash on it. She peeled off her second-hand coat, draped it over the back of a leather chair, and rolled up the sleeves of her simple blouse. "Clara Bennett," she whispered under her breath, "welcome to the wolf's den." She cracked the folder open. It was worse than she imagined. Contracts, financial projections, conflicting memos. Half the pages had scribbled notes in the margins, some in pen, some in pencil, some so faint they looked like ghosts on the paper. She flipped through them, eyes scanning for any sign of logic. None. This wasn't just misfiled paperwork. It was a minefield. And she had 6 hours to defuse it without blowing herself up. Clara dragged the files closer, pulled her battered tablet from her bag, and opened a blank spreadsheet. If there was one thing she'd learned from freelancing and teaching neighborhood kids for scraps, it was that the only way to survive chaos was to wrestle it into a shape she could control. She started slow. Names first. Who signed what when, and with which clause contradicting which promise. Her fingers tapped the tablet with frantic precision. She didn't notice the hours slipping by, the noise outside, the glass walls rising and falling like distant ocean waves. By the time Sophie Grant peeked in to check on her, Clara had filled 3 pages with her neat, tiny handwriting, cross-referenced 3 contracts, and found 2 clauses that directly contradicted each other. Sophie didn't come inside. She watched Clara work for a moment, a ghost of surprise flickering in her usually guarded eyes. Then she closed the door again, letting Clara sink back into her self-made battlefield. At some point, Clara's stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the single stale bagel she grabbed at sunrise. She reached for the cold coffee she'd set aside for when she came in, bitter, half empty, but still fuel. She forced it down and kept going. Every so often her mind would slip. A flicker of doubt. A phantom voice whispering, "You don't belong here. This isn't your world. You're wasting your time. You'll quit just like the rest." But every time the voice tried to crawl in, Clara slammed another fact into place on her spreadsheet. She'd lived her whole life with people telling her, no money, no chance, no future. But she was still standing. She was still here, and if Damien Lancaster thought she would be the next name on Sophie Grant's stack of resignation letters, he was going to be disappointed. By 3:30, she'd untangled the first major knot, 3 duplicate contracts buried under inconsistent language, all pointing to an unnecessary vendor charge that cost the company thousands every week. She highlighted the line in neon yellow on her screen and made a note: proposed consolidation. Potential annual savings: 6 figures. She caught herself smiling for the first time that day. Her back hurt. Her fingers were cramped. But for the first time in weeks, she felt evil. Necessary. Alphawi. She didn't know how much time had passed when the door opened behind her. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature, like someone had cracked open a window in the middle of December. Clara forced herself to keep typing, though her heart hammered so loudly, she wondered if he could hear it echoing off the glass walls. "Mr. Lancaster," she said without turning around. Damien didn't answer immediately. She could hear the soft tap of his polished shoes as he crossed the carpet, the subtle rustle of expensive fabric, as he leaned against the edge of the table. He didn't sit. He didn't offer her the dignity of comfort. He just stood there, a silent shadow of judgment. "Clara," he said finally, her name a test on his tongue. Clara kept her eyes on the screen. Almost done. She knew it sounded presumptuous, but she couldn't help herself. She'd been pushed this far. She might as well push back a little. Damien's eyes flicked to the mess of papers, her tablet, the half-empty coffee cup leaving a ring on his polished table. He picked up one of her scribbled pages, read the notes, and for a moment, the edge of his mouth twitched. She wasn't sure if it was irritation or something dangerously close to approval. "You found this vendor error on your own?" he asked, voice so calm it made her nerves dance. "Yes." Clara finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Gray eyes, face and iron, but behind them something else flickered, a calculation, maybe curiosity. "I cross-checked the last 3 quarterly statements. It's been double billed for months. If we cancel the redundant contract and merge the services, we save at least 60% on that department's overhead." Damien Lancaster did not blink. He simply held her stare, like he was reading lines on a balance sheet. Then, without warning, he pushed away from the table. 6 o'clock. Bring me the rest in my office. If it holds up, you'll stay tomorrow. If not, Clara didn't flinch. If not, I'll see myself out. Damien's eyes narrowed. He almost smiled. Almost 6 o'clock, Miss Bennett. He turned and left as silently as he'd come. The echo of his footsteps a promise that the real test hadn't even begun. Clara looked down at her notes, her cold coffee, the stack still waiting to be untangled. She pressed her palms flat to the table, breathing through the deep knot in her chest. One day, one chance, and she was not leaving this building until she proved to every ghost whispering in her ear that they were wrong about her. All of them. 6 o'clock arrived like a judge's gavel. Clara gathered her scattered notes, triple-checked her tablet, and rubbed her tired eyes one last time. Before pushing away from the conference table, she'd turned into her personal war zone. The entire 42nd floor had grown quieter as the day slipped toward evening. The hum of phones had died down, the secretaries and junior execs slipping away, and hushed groups eager to escape Lancaster Holdings' icy halls before nightfall. Only the brave, the foolish, or the trapped stayed late. In Damien Lancaster's world, Clara, it seemed, was all three. She smoothed her blouse, ignoring the wrinkle lines and the faint coffee stain on her cuff. She slipped her coat over her arm. No point pretending she was going anywhere else tonight, and walked the short distance down the polished corridor to the office that felt more like a fortress than a workspace. She paused just outside the massive double doors, steeling herself. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened glass, hair fraying loose from her bun, eyes lined with exhaustion, but sharpened by stubborn resolve. She knocked once. "Come in." His voice low and controlled as ever. Clara pushed the door open. Damien Lancaster sat behind his glass desk like a monarch on a modern throne, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened slightly, but no less intimidating for the hint of disarray. He didn't motion for her to sit. He simply gestured for the file. Clara crossed the wide expanse of the office and laid her stack of organized pages, annotated spreadsheets, and proposed corrections directly in front of him. She stood there, fighting the urge to fidget. Damien flipped the first page. The sound of paper brushing against his calloused fingers felt louder than the soft ticking of the sleek clock on the wall. Clara watched his eyes move left to right, narrowing occasionally, then widening by the slightest fraction whenever he stumbled on one of her highlighted corrections. He said nothing for a long time. Clara's legs began to ache, but she refused to shift her weight. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack under silence. He closed the final page and looked up. Clara braced herself. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his mouth, as if weighing how sharp to make his words. And yet when he spoke, his voice was almost conversational, almost. "How did you find the cross-billing discrepancy between the vendor invoices?" Clara met his eyes. The fourth version of the contract referenced an outdated tax code. I looked up the quarterly expense reports, compared the vendor statements, and found two companies billing for the same service under different department codes. Damien's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Not many people would think to trace it back that far. Clara's heart thumped, but her tone stayed even. "It didn't seem like your last assistants bothered to check." A faint flicker of amusement gone as quickly as it came. Or maybe they knew better than to point out my oversight. Clara tilted her chin just enough to hold her line without tipping into arrogance. "I wasn't pointing it out to embarrass you, Mr. Lancaster. I pointed it out because it's money bleeding out of your company." Damien let that hang between them. He tapped the stack of papers once with a single finger. "You stayed." Clara didn't blink. "You gave me 6 hours. I used them." He rose so suddenly that Clara took half a step back before she could stop herself. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, and he liked that tiny crack in her composure. He circled the desk, stopping inches from her. Without the protective shield of glass and polished wood between them, he felt taller, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "You understand what staying means, Miss Bennett?" His tone was soft enough to chill her to the bone. "Yes," she said. "It means tomorrow you'll expect more. And the next day, more than that. Until when? Until I either break or prove you wrong." The corner of his mouth curved. There it was. An almost smile that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. "Brave answer. Or foolish." Clara swallowed. "Sometimes they are the same thing." Damien's eyes locked on hers, unflinching, and for one breathless moment, Clara thought he might say something human, but the mask slid back into place. "Be here at 7 a.m. sharp. Sophie will give you the schedule. And Miss Bennet." He paused, leaning just close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadows of a man who hadn't slept properly in a decade. "Don't ever spill coffee on me again." Clara's laugh slipped out before she could stop it, a tiny sound brittle with exhaustion, but real. "I'll do my best, sir." Damien stepped back, studying her, as if she were both a risk and an investment. Then he turned away, without dismissing her, already reaching for his next file. Clara backed out of the office, her pulse drumming in her ears. The door shut behind her with a soft click that felt like a gunshot in the silence of the deserted hallway. For a long second, Clara just stood there. The weight of the day crashed over her all at once, but instead of collapsing under it, she felt something steadier settle in her chest. She'd survived day one. A tiny flame of defiance flickered to life as she turned and walked away from that glass fortress. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow the real battle would begin, and if Damien Lancaster thought she was going to be just another name on Sophie Grant's resignation pile, he was about to find out exactly how wrong he could be. Morning at Lancaster Holdings began long before the sun rose over Chicago's glass towers. By 6:45, Clara Bennet was already standing in the lobby with a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and her battered tablet tucked under her arm like a trusted weapon. She'd barely slept. A couple of hours on her creaky mattress, just enough to keep her brain from melting down, then back on the first bus into downtown, while the city still yawned itself awake. She didn't mind the ache behind her eyes, or the slight tremor in her hands. They reminded her why she was here, why she couldn't afford to file. She made her way to the express elevator that shot straight up to the top executive floors. A junior analyst stepped aside to let her in, his eyes wide when he recognized her face. Rumors traveled fast here. She could practically hear the whispers following her as the doors slid shut. "She's the one who lasted her first day. She's the one who made it to day 2. The elevator climbed so fast her ears popped. When the doors opened at the 42nd floor, Sophie Grant was already waiting near the reception desk, a leather binder tucked under her arm, her expression somewhere between disbelief and cautious respect. "Miss Bennet," Sophie said, motioning for Clara to follow her. "I half expected you to run during the night." Clara smiled faintly, stepping in beside her. "I couldn't afford the bus fare home if I did." Sophie almost laughed. "Almost." They moved down the hall, the early sunlight slicing through the panoramic windows and catching on the edges of glass and steel. "There's been a shift in the air since you showed up," Sophie said as they walked. "Some of the staff are curious. Others are just waiting for you to crack." Clara adjusted her grip on her tablet. "Let them watch." The HR manager shot her a quick look, measuring that stubborn spark in Clara's eyes. They reached Damien Lancaster's office. The doors were ajar. Sophie knocked once before nudging Clara forward. Inside, Damien was at his desk, already deep in a stack of new files. His dark hair looked freshly combed, but his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his forearms. He looked like a man who'd been here all night, and probably had. His eyes lifted the moment Clara stepped in. 7 a.m. "Sharp," he said. "Good. Tasty." She obeyed, ignoring the way her pulse spiked when his sharp gaze pinned her to the chair. Sophie stayed by the door, watching silently. Damien flipped through one of the folders, tapped a page, then slid it across the desk. Clara leaned forward. "The Morrison account," he said. "It's in disarray. Vendor delays, billing conflicts, missing correspondence. I want it untangled and organized by lunch." Clara scanned the top page. It was worse than the chaos she'd faced yesterday. Hundreds of pages scattered through dozens of files, some so outdated they looked like they'd been pulled from a dusty basement archive. Lunch, she asked, arching an eyebrow before she could stop herself. Damien didn't blink. Lunch. Clara nodded once, forcing down the knot of panic swelling in her chest. Consider it done. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face with that unsettling calm that made her want to shift in her seat. But she didn't. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Sophie, Damien said, dismissing her with a flick of his hand. Sophie shot Clara a glance that said, "Good luck, girl," then slipped out, closing the door behind her. For a heartbeat, Clara and Damien just stared at each other. The city beyond the windows gleamed under the rising sun. The hum of the heating system was the only sound in the tense silence between them. Damien broke it first. "Yesterday you surprised me, Miss Bennet." Clara clasped her hands together in her lap to stop her fingers from drumming on her knee. "I'm glad I could." His eyes narrowed slightly, picking apart every word for weakness. "Don't think you're indispensable. Nobody is. Especially not up here." Clara leaned forward, her voice steady. "Then I'll just have to make myself difficult to replace." For a split second, a flicker of something like respect crossed his features before he killed it dead. "See that you do." He nodded toward the stack of files waiting for her in the small meeting room adjoining his office. "You can work in there. Bring any questions directly to me." Clara gathered the folders, and paused at the threshold of the glass-walled room. She felt his eyes on her back as she stepped inside, the door clicking shut between them, but not shutting out the feeling that she was still being watched. The next 4 hours blurred into a mess of signatures, date stamps, conflicting emails, and late payment notice. Clara hunched over the long table pages, spread out like puzzle pieces. She scribbled notes, highlighted inconsistencies, muttered to herself when she spotted another hole in the chain of approvals. More than once, she caught Damien's reflection in the glass wall. He'd stand at the edge of his own office, watching her for a minute or two, saying nothing. Each time she forced herself not to look up, not to acknowledge the weight of his eyes. At exactly 12:15, Clara stepped back into his office, her arms full of color-coded binders and her tablet glowing with a final report. Damien put down his pen as she approached. "Done?" he asked, voice as flat as polished steel. Clara laid everything in front of him, with the same care she might use to defuse a bomb. Organized, flagged, and summarized. "I found 2 duplicate vendor payments and 3 contract amendments that were never approved." She held his stare, daring him to find a flaw. Damien flipped the top binder open, scanned a few pages, then glanced at her with an unreadable expression. "And you're sure about these discrepancies?" Clara nodded once. Triple-checked. Damien closed the binder, leaned back, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. It was small. It was sharp. It was dangerous. "Congratulations, Miss Bennet. You've just proven you might actually belong here." Clara felt her chest tighten with something that might have been pride, or maybe it was just the awareness that every time he gave her an inch of approval, it only pulled her deeper into his world. Damien Lancaster's approval was a dangerous thing. Clara knew it the moment she stepped out of his office, with the binders still warm from his hands. It wasn't praise exactly. It wasn't even kindness. It was more like a signal fire, a warning to everyone watching that the new girl wasn't just another name waiting to vanish quietly with a cardboard box of personal belongings. Word traveled fast on the 42nd floor. By the time Clara returned to her small borrowed workspace, whispers were already rippling through the outer offices. People glanced up from their desks as she passed. Some looked curious, some skeptical, but a few looked almost hopeful. Maybe they'd needed someone to break the cycle. Maybe they wanted to see Damien Lancaster lose this particular battle just once. Clara didn't have time to wonder. Sophie caught up with her in the corridor, a fresh folder, tucked under her arm like a concealed blade. "He wants you to prep the lander's brief for tomorrow," she said, falling into step beside Clara. "That's a 3-person job." "I know." And he wants you to do it alone. Of course he does, Clara murmured, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sophie handed over the folder. Their fingers brushed Sophie's nails immaculate. Clara's bitten short ink still smudged on the tips. Sophie lowered her voice. He's testing you. You know that. Clara gave a humorless laugh. So everyone keeps saying. Sophie hesitated, then added softer. He pushes until people break. It's not personal. He just doesn't trust anyone who can't outlast him. Clara tilted her head. And how about you? Do you think I'll last? Sophie met her eyes for a long moment, then surprised her by reaching out to straighten the collar of Clara's blouse like an older sister might. I think you're either going to outlast him or set this whole place on fire trying. Just don't lose yourself, Clara. Not for him. Not for this place. Before Clara could reply, Sophie turned and vanished back toward HR, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and another impossible deadline. She didn't leave the office that night. Not really. After half the building had gone home and the cleaning crews had whispered past her glass walls, Clara was still there, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled into a hasty knot, her tablet surrounded by spread-out legal pads, half-empty coffee cups, and a single protein bar she'd saved from lunch. Somewhere near midnight, she felt rather than heard a presence behind her. She didn't need to look up. Damien's reflection in the glass gave him away. He stood just outside the conference room, hands in his pockets, watching her, as if she were a complicated equation he hadn't quite solved. Clara forced her shoulders to stay square, her eyes glued to the lines of fine print she was cross-referencing. If he was waiting for her to flinch, he'd be waiting a long time. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only seconds, his voice cut through the hush like a blade. Miss Bennet. Clara marked her place with her pen and turned in her seat. Mr. Lancaster. His gaze swept over the papers, the scrawled notes pinned with paperweights, the cold coffee. And you're here because you told me to have the Landers brief ready for tomorrow. I'm having it ready. His mouth twitched a ghost of a smile that almost looked human. You're not paid to sleep here, Miss Bennet. Clara met his eyes. Then I'll send you my invoice for the overnight rate. A dangerous thing, that smile of his, because it almost made him look like a man, rather than a machine built out of ice and ambition. Damien stepped inside the room, picking up one of her marked-up pages. He scanned it with unsettling speed. You flagged the merger clause. Clara stood, bracing her hands on the table. It's contradictory. The client's original terms conflict with the new revisions. If we don't address it, the Landers team can hold us in breach of contract next quarter. Damien's gray eyes flicked to hers. So you've decided to rewrite it for them. Clara didn't flinch. I'm making sure we don't look incompetent when we meet tomorrow. I'd rather fix it now than get blindsided in front of a boardroom full of people waiting for us to slip. Damien dropped the paper onto the table. His fingers brushed hers, cold as marble. You don't think you're overstepping? Her heart hammered, but her chin didn't drop. If I'm overstepping, tell me. If I'm right, thank me. He stepped closer, so close she could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the tired lines near his eyes. And if you're wrong, Clara held his stare. Then I'll fix it. Before he could reply, her stomach betrayed her. A low, unmistakable growl rumbled between them, loud enough to echo off the glass. Clara wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Damien's eyes dropped to her midsection, then back up. When did you last eat? He asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. The protein bar wrapper crinkled on the table like an accusation. He sighed, an actual sigh that made him look for a heartbeat, like a man more than a legend. Come on. What? She blinked. Come with me. He was already moving, pulling open the door, waiting for her to follow. Clara looked at the stacks of work, the blinking cursor on her tablet. If you're going to work through the night, he said without looking back. You'll do it with real food. Or you won't do it at all. It wasn't a request. It wasn't kindness either. But as she fell into step behind him, trailing his tall frame through the hushed hallway, Clara realized something unsettling. She didn't mind it. Not yet. The executive break lounge on the 42nd floor looked less like an office kitchen and more like a private club someone had carved out of dark wood and Italian marble. Soft, recessed lights glowed over granite counters, lined with expensive coffee machines and polished steel appliances Clara had only ever seen in glossy magazine ads. She'd walked past this door a dozen times in the last 2 days, always assuming it was just another room off limits to someone like her. Now she was following Damien Lancaster inside her sneakers, squeaking slightly against the pristine floor, feeling like an intruder in a world she'd been allowed to glimpse but never touch. Damien crossed to the far wall, where a sleek refrigerator hummed softly. He didn't speak as he pulled it open, rummaging through organized shelves of fresh fruit, imported mineral water, and tiny glass containers with handwritten labels. Clara hovered near the door, hugging her elbows, painfully aware of the dark circles under her eyes, the ink smudge on her wrist, the hair that kept falling out of her bun. He straightened a container in each hand. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the long counter with its row of high-backed stools. Clara didn't move. "I'm fine, really. I can grab a vending machine snack and sit," he repeated, not looking at her. His tone left no room for negotiation. So she obeyed, sliding onto the nearest stool, trying not to look as small and out of place as she felt. Damien set the containers on the counter, opened one, and handed her a fork. Inside was a neat arrangement of grilled chicken quinoa and roasted vegetables that looked like it belonged in an overpriced health cafe, not in the hands of someone who'd survived on gas station coffee and stale bagels for weeks. "Eat." Clara stared at it, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" Damien leaned against the counter opposite her, arms crossed, watching her with that same cold, unreadable stare. "You're no good to me if you pass out at the table. I'm not your charity case, Mr. Lancaster." A flicker of something sharp, was it amusement, crossed his eyes. "Then don't be. Earn the meal by finishing the Landers brief properly. Or starve. Your choice." Clara snorted under her breath and stabbed a piece of chicken with the tiny bamboo fork. She didn't want to admit how good it tasted, how long it had been since she'd eaten something warm that didn't come out of a paper bag. Damien opened the other container for himself, a salad that looked more like a still life painting than actual food. He didn't sit. He just stood there, taking measured bites, watching her the way a hawk might watch a mouse, deciding whether to bolt. After a few moments of tense silence, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked. His fork paused midway to his mouth. "Excuse me, sleep. Do you ever do it? Because every time I walk in here, you look exactly the same, like you've been here since the building was poured from concrete." The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile gone as fast as it came. "I sleep when I have time to waste." "And when's that?" He set the fork down, container half finished, and leveled his stare at her. "When the job is done." Clara let out a small laugh that tasted like bitterness and exhaustion. "That's not living." Damien tilted his head slightly, as if trying to figure out whether she was mocking him or offering him something dangerously close to honesty. "You think you understand my life. After 2 days, I think you built a prison and forgot you're the one inside it." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, maybe the sudden warmth of real food waking her up enough to remember how to push back. She braced herself for him to snap, maybe, to fire her on the spot, to tell her to pack her few things and never come back. Instead, Damien just studied her eyes, cool and curious. "And what about you, Miss Bennett? What prison have you built?" Clara set her fork down carefully, the taste of roasted carrots suddenly gone bland on her tongue. Mine's made of Bill's overdue rent, and a mother who can't pay for her own medicine. My prison doesn't have marble counters and stocked refrigerators. Damien's eyes didn't waver. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something flicker behind them. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. But just as quickly the wall came down again. "You're wasting time," he said, his voice slipping back into that clipped authority she was learning to hate and admire in equal measure. "The brief needs to be ready by 7 a.m. Clara let out a short laugh. So this was the reward for surviving one impossible deadline another. And yet she wiped her hands with a napkin she hadn't realized she was clutching, and met his gaze head on. "Then I'll get back to work." Damien stepped aside, holding the door open as she brushed past him. His sleeve brushed her arm, cold cotton and expensive cologne, and something else, an energy that made her heart stutter, even though she hated herself for noticing. She paused at the threshold, turning back for one last shot whose thought she couldn't swallow. "Thank you for the food, Mr. Lancaster. Next time, don't pretend it's just about the job." His eyes darkened, but he didn't say a word. Clara turned and walked back into the silent hallway, her pulse thrumming like a drum in her chest. She didn't know if she'd just won a point or crossed a line that would cost her everything. But as she pushed open the door to her makeshift office, spread out her notes, and picked up her hunt again, Clara knew one thing for certain. Whatever battle she'd stepped into with Damien Lancaster, it was far from over, and she wasn't planning to lose. The rest of the night passed in a haze of scribbled notes, blinking cursor lines, and the soft hum of the building's heating system, switching over as the outside temperature dropped. Clara's eyes burned as she scanned clause after clause, redrafted half the financial tables, and merged 3 separate email chains that contradicted each other so thoroughly. It felt like trying to piece together a shredded confession. By 4 in the morning, her head buzzed with exhaustion, but her resolve held steady. She'd learned a long time ago that fatigue was just another kind of background noise. You could tune it out if you wanted something badly enough. Around 5, she stood to stretch. The city below was still dark, the early winter sunrise hours away. The glass walls of her makeshift office reflected her tired figure. Back at her hair, a mess. Sleeves wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes, deeper than ever. She almost laughed at herself. This wasn't what she'd dreamed about when she'd pictured being part of a big company. But it was hers now, this seat at the edge of the lion's den, and she wasn't giving it up for anything. She stepped out to refill her water at the break lounge. The hallway was silent, empty. But as she turned the corner, she stopped short. Damien Lancaster was standing there, one hand braced on the countertop, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours, though his hair was neater than hers, and his white shirt sleeves were freshly rolled. His voice was low, but firm. "I said no delays. I don't care if the Hong Kong team wants a cushion, they've had weeks. If they can't deliver by tonight, they're out." His eyes flicked to her just once, registering her presence, before he continued. He listened to whoever was on the other end for another few seconds, then ended the call with a curt, "Make it happen." He pocketed the phone and turned fully toward her. "Miss Bennett." She lifted her half-empty water bottle like a shield. "Didn't know I needed permission to hydrate." His mouth twitched just barely. A ghost of amusement, though his eyes were anything but soft. He stepped closer, leaning a hip against the counter. "You look like hell. You don't pay me for my beauty sleep." Remember, she regretted it the moment it slipped out. Too bold, too sharp at this hour. But to her surprise, Damien didn't bark back. He studied her face, the dark smudges under her eyes, the ink stains on her fingertips. "You've been at it all night." She took a sip of water just to keep her mouth busy. "You gave me an impossible job. I'm making it possible." He reached out, surprising her when his fingers brushed a stray piece of hair off her forehead. The touch was quick, businesslike almost, yet it left a trail of heat in its wake that made her pulse stutter. She hated that he could do that with just a touch. "You're not like the others," he murmured more to himself than to her. She forced out a laugh that sounded harsher than she meant. "That's what every tyrant says, right before they break you in half." His eyes flicked back to hers, and for 1 second, Clara thought she saw something raw there, something tired, maybe even lonely, but it vanished just as fast. "I don't break people, Miss Bennet. I reveal them." He turned open a cabinet and pulled down another of those ridiculous glass containers. He peeled the lid off, revealing neatly sliced fruit, and handed it to her. "Eat." It wasn't a request. Clara hesitated. She wanted to throw it back at him, to prove she didn't need his pity or his orders. But her stomach overruled her pride. She accepted the container and picked out a slice of melon. Sweet, cold, and more refreshing than the stale coffee she'd been living on. Damien watched her chew like he was checking if she'd flinch at being fed. When she didn't, he nodded once, approval disguised as dismissal. "You'll have the Landers brief ready by 7. Clara set the container down and met his eyes squarely. "I will." "Good." His phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket, read something on the screen, then looked back at her. "After the presentation tomorrow, you'll come with me to the Hong Kong debrief." Clara's brows shot up. "I'm a secretary, Mr. Lancaster. You're a translator, a researcher, a fixer, and apparently the only person in this building who bothers to read the fine print." He stepped closer again, voice lowering. "I need someone who sees the mistakes before they cost me millions. Do you want the seat or not?" Clara's pulse thrummed. She hated how tempted she was by the challenge, by the way it made her feel needed, like her presence actually mattered in this cold machine of glass and steel. She swallowed her fear. "When do we leave?" Damien's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like a promise. "Tonight. Pack a bag light. We won't have time for sleep once we're there." Clara grabbed another piece of fruit, just to keep her hands busy. "You really don't believe in sleeping, do you?" He tilted his head, eyes locked on hers. "Not when there's work to do." And with that he turned and strode back toward his office, the corridor swallowing him up again. Clara stared at the container of fruit on the counter, then at her reflection in the stainless steel door. She was in deeper now, deeper than she'd planned, deeper than she'd wanted. But somewhere under the exhaustion and uncertainty, a spark of excitement flickered in her chest. Whatever Damien Lancaster was building, she was part of it now. And she would not be the one to blink first. By 7 in the morning, Clara was standing in the gleaming executive boardroom on the 42nd floor, a steaming cup of bitter coffee in her hand, the Landers brief perfectly printed, annotated, and stacked on the long glass table. Through the wall of windows, Chicago's skyline was waking up under a wash of pale winter light. But inside Lancaster Holdings, the air was sharp and electric, like the seconds before a thunderstorm hit. The Landers team arrived right on time. 5 stone-faced men in tailored suits, each carrying sleek black folders and the same tight smiles that said, "We're here to find your mistakes." Clara stood just behind Damien's left shoulder, her posture straight, her tablet balanced against her hip. She'd barely had time to shower and throw her hair into a low knot before Damien's driver whisked her back to the office from her cramped apartment. She'd packed a single small suitcase, now waiting in the Sophie's office, proof that whatever came next, she wasn't turning back. Damien Lancaster looked exactly as he always did. Immaculate suit. No tie today, but a crisp white shirt that somehow made him look more dangerous than formal wear ever could. He sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, watching the Landers men file in, like a predator who'd already tasted the first drop of blood. "Good morning, gentlemen," Damien said, voice smooth as cut stone. "I trust you've reviewed the draft we sent overnight." One of the older men, gray hair, European accent, arched a brow as he dropped into a seat. We have, and we have concerns. Of course you do. Damien gestured to Clara without taking his eyes off the Landers negotiator. Miss Bennet, the projections. Clara stepped forward, sliding a neatly collated packet in front of each man. The pages were crisp, color-coded, every note exactly where it needed to be. As she moved, she could feel Damien's gaze flick to her just once, and unspoken good. The lead negotiator flipped the first page, his colleagues peering over his shoulder. Silence fell for a beat. Then this clause. He tapped the page with a manicured finger. This contradicts the initial scope agreement. We can't sign with that language. Clara opened her mouth before Damien could speak. Actually, that was the problem I flagged. If you look at page 4, you'll see we drafted a revised clause that aligns with the original scope and the updated compliance regulations. She leaned forward, pointing without hesitation. It's highlighted here in blue. And we've cross-checked the local contract law. This version holds up in arbitration if it ever comes to that. The older man stared at her, then flipped pages, muttering to the colleague beside him in German. Clara caught fragments of it. Sharp girl didn't expect this. No leverage now. Damien sat back, his gaze resting lazily on Clara, as if she'd just played his final card, exactly when he wanted it. When the negotiators finally looked up, Damien's tone dropped half an octave. Any further concerns? The gray-haired man's jaw tightened. No? I suppose the revised language is acceptable. Good. Damien closed his copy of the brief with a soft thud that echoed across the glass table. Then we're done here. His eyes didn't move from the lead negotiator's face. Unless you'd like to keep wasting my time. The room was dead silent. The Landers men exchanged tight smiles. Forced handshakes were made. Departure pleasantries murmured. Clara could practically feel the adrenaline in her veins vibrating as the doors finally shut behind the last of them. Damien didn't move for a moment. He just sat there, fingers still steepled, eyes locked on the far windows as if calculating how many more obstacles he could flatten before lunch. Clara cleared her throat, her voice steadier than she felt. So, we're going to Hong Kong tonight. Damien's eyes snapped to her, sharp and assessing, but there was something else too, something that almost looked like a flicker of approval. You handled that well. They didn't expect you to speak up. Clara shrugged, setting her tablet on the table to hide the tremor in her fingers. Then maybe they'll learn not to underestimate the secretary next time. Damien's mouth curved just barely. That dangerous, not quite smile that said he was already 3 steps ahead. Pack your passport. Sophie has your itinerary. We're wheels up at 9. Clara arched an eyebrow. So I'm your fixie, sir, and your carry-on. If you're lucky, you'll be too busy working to notice the jet lag. Clara crossed her arms, feeling a burst of tired defiance pushing up through the exhaustion. And if I fail, Damien stood, straightening his cuffs, stepping close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. Don't. His tone was so calm, so absolute, it made the air between them hum. Or do. And prove me right about everyone else. The silence stretched. Clara hated him in that moment, hated how he made her feel seen and invisible all at once. But she also hated how much she wanted him to not be right. She exhaled, grabbed her tablet, and brushed past him, her shoulder grazing his arm. I'll see you at the airport, Mr. Lancaster. As she walked out, she heard him say low enough that only she could hear, good girl. She didn't turn. She didn't trust herself to. Because beneath the armor she'd built in just 3 days, something dangerous was beginning to stir, something she wasn't sure she could contain much longer. And Hong Kong, that was going to be the real test. The private jet waiting for them at the edge of the tarmac looked like it could swallow Clara's entire apartment building and still have room for a cocktail bar and a boardroom. She'd never been on a plane like this. She'd never even been near a plane like this. The closest she'd come to luxury travel was watching first-class passengers sip champagne as she shuffled past a seat 34 briefly wedged between a crying toddler and a man who insisted on claiming both armrests. Now she stood at the foot of the jet's stairs overnight bag, slung over her shoulder coat, clutched tight against the cold Chicago wind, her breath visible in the floodlights. Damien was already halfway up the steps, phone pressed to his ear, voice low, but cutting as he issued instructions in that unhurried tone that could probably make a grown man rethink his entire career in 30 seconds flat. Clara stared at the spotless metal steps for a beat longer than she should have, then took a breath, squared her shoulders, and climbed. Inside the cabin felt less like an airplane and more like an exclusive hotel suite. Butter-soft leather seats, sleek paneling, a polished table already set with neat stacks of documents. A flight attendant with perfect posture offered to take her coat. Clara handed it over, fighting the irrational impulse to apologize for how cheap the fabric must feel in hands accustomed to cashmere and silk. Damien ended his call as she settled into the seat across from him. He looked tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes, now subtle lines at the corners, that made him look more like a man and less like a marble statue carved from ambition. He didn't comment on her lateness. He simply opened a folder, slid it toward her, and spoke as the engines rumbled to life outside. "We'll be landing in Hong Kong at dawn. You'll have 4 hours to rest at the hotel before the debrief." Clara flipped through the folder, financials, updated minutes. From the Hong Kong office, a list of red-flagged expense items that made her eyebrows arch, despite her exhaustion. She met his eyes. "And what will you be doing while I sleep?" Damien leaned back, one arm draped over the leather seat's edge, his voice deceptively mild. "Preparing to make sure the Hong Kong branch remembers who signs their paychecks." Clara resisted the urge to smile. How comforting. The hum of the engines rose the floor beneath her feet, vibrating faintly. She braced a hand on the armrest as the jet began to taxi. She should have felt the rush of liftoff, should have been giddy or terrified or at least something. But all she felt was that strange thrum in her chest again, like she was stepping onto a tightrope that stretched far past the edge of everything safe and familiar. For the first hour they worked in silence. Damien reviewed digital reports on his tablet, annotating figures with swift praise movements. Clara cross-referenced vendor agreements, flagged outliers in the expense statements, and quietly adjusted 3 errors in a subclause that no one else seemed to have caught. Every so often he'd glance at her over the edge of his screen, not with irritation, worse with interest. When the flight attendant returned with a tray, 2 small bowls of soup, fresh bread, hot tea, Damien barely glanced up. "Eat." Clara dipped her spoon into the soup, savoring the warmth more than the musty. "You know," she said after a minute, voice pitched just low enough to test him, "I didn't expect gourmet meals on the job description." Damien didn't look up from his tablet. "You'd prefer the vending machine," she snorted under her breath. "I'd prefer to remember what my bed feels like." He paused, then tapped his screen once, locking eyes with her. "This is what you signed up for. No illusions, no mercy." She held his stare for a moment, too long enough to feel that same spark she'd felt the first time she'd stood toe-to-toe with him in his glass fortress. "I know exactly what I signed up for, Mr. Lancaster." Do you? The corners of his mouth twitched, but he didn't reply. Instead, he reached across the table and flicked his finger over the page she'd been editing. "This number, why did you adjust it?" Clara leaned forward, pointing to the entry. "Double billing from an old vendor agreement. Someone forgot to cancel the auto-renewal clause when the new supply chain kicked in. You would have paid them twice for services you haven't needed for 6 months." Damien's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with razor-sharp calculation. You enjoy this, don't you? Finding what others miss. Clara's heart thudded. She didn't want to admit it, but the answer came out anyway, honest and raw in a way she didn't expect. I like knowing the work matters, that if I do my job right, I'm not just here to look pretty behind a desk. His expression shifted so subtle she almost missed it. Approval, maybe. Or something darker. He leaned back, drumming his fingers once on the armrest. Rest when we land. You'll need it. Clara arched an eyebrow. Will you? Damien's eyes met hers, unflinching, steady, something like a storm trapped behind glass. No. And neither will you if you stay in my orbit long enough. The jet hummed through the night, slicing across continents and time zones at impossible speeds. Somewhere beyond the windows, darkness stretched all the way to dawn. In the cabin, Clara finished her soup in silence. Damien returned to his screens, and somewhere between the drone of the engines and the soft glow of the reading light above her seat, she realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She wasn't just surviving him anymore. She was matching him beat for ruthless beat. And the scary thing was, she liked it. When the wheels touched down at Hong Kong International, Clara felt like she'd slept for 2 minutes and aged 10 years. The sunrise outside the oval windows was a smudge of pink and gold over a city bristling with glass towers, container ships, and a million strangers moving at a speed she could almost feel vibrating through the tarmac. Damien hadn't closed his eyes once. Clara had drifted into a shallow, uneasy nap for maybe 20 minutes somewhere over the Pacific, but when she'd cracked her eyes open, he'd still been there. Same posture, same expression, tablet aglow, with columns of numbers and terse email replies. He looked like he fed on exhaustion, the way other people drank coffee. Now in the back seat of a black sedan weaving through Hong Kong's glass canyons, Clara tried to gather herself. Damien sat beside her, perfectly composed, typing something on his phone in clipped bursts. She couldn't stop sneaking glances at him, the way his profile looked carved out of granite. In the early light, the faint creases at his temples that only deepened when he concentrated. And under it all, that restless pull she'd started to feel on the plane, like a wispy thread humming between them, that neither of them would acknowledge. Stop staring, Miss Bennet, he said without looking up from his phone. Clara jerked her eyes forward, heat creeping up her neck. I'm not. You are. He pocketed his phone, shifting to face her fully, his knee brushing hers in the tight space. What's your plan for the debrief? She swallowed. He wasn't going to offer an apology or pretend she hadn't been caught. Of course he wouldn't. And she found, oddly, she didn't want him to. The expense discrepancies first, she said, her voice steadying. Then the duplicated vendor contracts. Then the undocumented cash outflows you flagged from the quarterlies. He studied her, his expression unreadable, but somehow more open than usual. You sound ready. I am ready. He leaned back, a ghost of that shark-like smile pulling at his mouth. Then don't flinch when they try to corner you. They think you're a secretary who doesn't know what a balance sheet is. Clara tilted her chin. Let them think that. Makes it easier to land the punch. Damien's eyes gleamed for half a second approval, maybe even something close to amusement. Good. The Lancaster Holdings branch in Hong Kong occupied the top floors of a curved tower that seemed to cut the clouds themselves. The glass-walled conference room where the debrief was set up looked out over the harbor where cranes moved shipping containers, like pieces on an invisible chessboard. The local executives waited at the table. 3 men in dark suits, 2 women in the severe blazers, and a young finance director who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Clara could see the worry etched in the lines around his mouth as she set her files down next to Damien's. Damien didn't waste time. He opened with a blunt recitation of the quarter's missed targets and the overspending that had triggered his surprise visit. No warmth, no preamble, just clean surgical facts that made the room shrink with each word. Clara sat silent beside him until he shifted slightly, a signal so subtle no one else would have caught it. She slid her summary packet across the table. "You have double billing with the same vendor in Shenzhen," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "There's a six-figure discrepancy in shipping that's been coded as miscellaneous overhead. And you have a labor contract for a consulting firm that no one can seem to explain, despite the fact that you paid them for 8 consecutive months." One of the men, Chang, the branch CFO, scoffed. "That's a clerical misunderstanding." Clara raised her brows. "A misunderstanding worth $250,000. The tension in the room thickened. She could feel Damien watching her, not as a test this time, but as if he was daring her to push harder. So she did. "If you're telling me your local accountants can't read your vendor agreements, maybe you should say that plainly. Then we'll know which heads need to roll." Chang's face darkened. Beside him, the young finance director dropped his eyes to the table, cheeks burning. Damien's voice cut in smooth as a scalpel. "Miss Bennett's point is simple. I don't tolerate leaks in my pipeline. If you can't plug them, I'll find someone who will." The room went dead quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Clara let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer before she gathered her papers. "We'll expect a revised ledger by Friday," she said, pushing back her chair. "And this time, gentlemen, make sure you read your own faith in print. I won't be so polite next quarter." She stood. Damien rose too, his towering presence blocking any final protestists. For a moment their eyes locked. Clara's pulse hammered as she felt it, that dangerous crack in the wall between them. Respect, admiration, and something sharper neither of them could name yet. As they left the room, the branch staff frozen in their seats, Damien leaned down so only she could hear. "You know you didn't have to bury them that deep." Clara slipped her pen behind her ear, fighting a smile that threatened to crack her professional mask. "You didn't hire me to be nice, Mr. Lancaster." He chuckled, an actual low sound that made her chest tighten in a way that terrified and thrilled her all at once. "No," he murmured as the elevator doors slid shut behind them. "No, I did not."